Welcome to Real Time Review. I'm your host, Jesse Nussman. With me, as always, fellow Atlanta film critic Jason Evans.
Hey, buddy.
Jason, we have a great episode this week. We're going to be talking about Steve Martin, who's the subject of a new documentary that people can check out on Apple. But first, we got to talk about two other wild, crazy guys named Kong.
Wait, did you plan that?
I actually did plan that. I came up with that in the kitchen last night and was just like, I'm saving this in my back pocket. But the big movie of the weekend is Godzilla times God, the New Empire. Is that what this thing is called?
Yeah, Godzilla X Kong. I was like, it's funny, I was thinking about it, I was like, is it Frozen Empire or the New Empire? And then I remember Ghostbusters Frozen. Literally,
there's something in the air about empires in Hollywood.
Yeah, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire and then Godzilla times Kong, the New Empire.
Right.
For centuries, there was harmony. The Titans were the guardians of nature, and the great apes became the protectors of humanity.
Both these films, oh man.
I thought this was one of the more kind of like excruciating sit-downs I've had in a movie theater all year. And look, sometimes people can label us critics as snobs. I am not above a great monster movie. You and I were here just months ago talking about a great, fun Godzilla movie.
Yeah.
This one, I'm going to steal a phrase from you that I thought of afterwards. You describe yourself as someone who's a slave to story. I would say this is a movie that is all plot, no story, in that it is just characters moving from, we need to go to this spot so we can get this thing, or this monster needs to defeat this person so he can get this power up. And I felt like I was watching a video game, like when you're sitting on your couch and the person next to you is playing a video game and you just have to passively watch them go through the motions.
Yeah, they have all these different quests that they have to accomplish along the line, none of which actually connect to anything else or make any sense. The plot is even more ridiculous than usual. You mentioned powering up. Early in the movie, Godzilla is powering up and getting stronger and stronger, and they're all like, ooh, I wonder why. And we as an audience are supposed to think, oh, it's because he's preparing to face the big bad guy at the end. But there's nothing the bad guy's doing at that point that would cause Godzilla to need to power up. Like, the bad guy is where he has been for thousands of years and just kind of chilling there. I mean, yes, Godzilla encounters him later on, but like, why is the power? The plot makes no sense at all, and what makes really no sense is the way any of the human characters act. I didn't find any of them even remotely interesting or believable. They are here as exposition dumps and to make funny quips. That's all they exist for.
Yes.
You can't connect.
Poor Rebecca Hall, Brian Tyree Henry, and Dan Stevens, who literally get saddled with like almost nothing to do. But
Dan Stevens just cracks jokes the entire movie, which would be fine, except this is a film in which over and over again, like, the monsters kill tens of thousands, if not millions of humans. The movie doesn't care. The monsters destroy cities, artifacts, but historical places.
It really makes you think of like passively, like us just watching all of this like destruction just pile up on screen, and the sort of disconnect with kind of the human toll on the ground. And
I mean, the pity is that the movie doesn't care about any of those things.
No.
And I'm sitting here in the audience, and I couldn't help but think of Godzilla Minus One that you mentioned earlier, which is a film that's about the humans. Godzilla is there as, an avatar for grief, for loss, for suffering and pain, and how you endure that. In this film, it's like the humans are the avatar. The humans are the metaphor. Although I'm not even sure what they're there for.
Are they, though, or are they just sort of like there to explain to you, like, this is Schmoogly Bob and Godzilla's got to defeat him to get his, pink little light up of power or something like that. I'm curious, what do you think is the secret to making a good Godzilla movie and a good Kong movie, which I think are kind of two separate things. Like you mentioning with Godzilla, like, I agree with you. I think the better Godzilla movies see Godzilla as like an allegory or an avatar for various different kinds of disasters, whether they're man-made or natural. I think this movie even doesn't work as a great Kong movie because the best Kong movies play with that kind of like, there's a soul behind those eyes and like a human
Kong
connection.
Is way more emotional, way more, because he is simian because he's an ape.
Because he's a mammal.
Right, exactly. He's more human than Godzilla is, and we read a lot more emotion into him. Like, for example, I thought Kong Skull Island was actually a fairly good Kong movie. That was sort of one of the first ones of this series. I think the thing that works in these movies has got to be the connection between the monster, what they're doing, and the human characters.
Yeah.
We are, after all, humans.
Yeah.
That's who we can
relate to. And I think there's
to.
a missed opportunity even in this movie of there's like a little child character that's meant to have this connection with Kong, but that character is such a nothing burger that if you were to make that the center of the movie and have this kind of E.T. relationship there, like that might be something, but the movie is so just concerned with like, we got to get to the next thing and get to this next power and this next thing.
Yeah, and her connection with Kong doesn't end up mattering for any reason. There's so many things that happen in this movie where when you watch the finale, you go, well, did any of that stuff that happened earlier matter to get here? And really, none of it does. It's a real pity. I mean, I will say this. I think if you're someone out there who is super excited about this movie, like, oh, wow, another one. If you saw the previous ones and thought they were great, yeah, sure. This is going to have giant monsters fighting and knocking over buildings and all that other kind of stuff. Yeah, it
but
does
even
that,
then, it feels like you got to get through like 90 minutes of just nonsense to get to like the thing you're paying the ticket to go see.
There are people out there who are listening to us right now who are probably saying they don't understand, and they just want to have the fun of the insanity of
the YouTubers are going to come after us. So
exactly. They want the insanity of these monsters that are the size of skyscrapers fighting each other. Okay, fine. I think you can do that and also have a story.
I agree.
Fact, in this MonsterVerse, in this series, they've done that a couple times, and not to great success, but to some success. In this movie, it feels like they've completely abandoned it. And the last thing I want to say about it is, so this is the cheapest of these movies. It cost $150 million.
Yeah.
Just still a lot of money, but compared to the others, this is relatively cheaper. Did you think it looked good? I thought it, like the bad guy, the Scar King, I think they call him. The
giant
CGI looks terrible. It looks terrible. Baby Kong, like King Kong looks good. Godzilla looks pretty good, I guess. But a lot of the other CGI monsters, to me, they look like, you described a video game, they look like video game characters.
I think it is a good comparison too of like, even, the argument to that could be people saying like, well, if you look at like the old Toho Godzilla movies, like those are very clearly cheaply made. But I think there's something about
That's a dude in a suit, though.
Right. I think there's something about the tactility of that and seeing like it's actually a person in a suit, like fighting another person in a suit or like destroying a model. There's a sort of visceral, tangible element to that as opposed to like when it's all animated, it just sort of feels like weightless nonsense happening all around you.
Yeah, this movie exists exclusively in a computer, and they didn't want to spend a lot of money on the computers.
So let's talk about Steve Martin and this Steve Martin documentary that is being broken up into kind of two parts on Apple. First part is largely focusing on Steve Martin's...
You can explain it to people by... Part one is called Then.
Yes,
part two
is
called
Now.
and they are very, very different documentaries.
I kind of told you right before we started recording, I found my encouragement to people watching us is just skip part one and watch part two, which you'll save yourself about 90 minutes, and you get, I think part two is way more interesting. I felt I learned more about who Steve Martin is as a person, about his connection to his art in part two, which is largely him in present day kind of reflecting on his career and the relationships he's had, and as well as like what all these different artistic interests he's had over his life, from stand-up, from movies, from art collecting to playing the banjo, how that kind of informs who he is.
There's a lot of animation.
Yeah, being a cartoonist on the side too, and I thought that was a much more interesting way into exploring what we get from all the talking heads people, the friends in his life who are like, yeah, Steve's kind of like a shy, private person, but this movie's in being like, well, here's how this private person has actually been telling us all about himself all along through the art that he makes, as opposed to part one just sort of felt like a Wikipedia dump to me.
Well, so I'll push back a little bit in that I think it was essential for part one to really explain to you I think most of us became aware of Steve Martin in the mid-'70s as you're a little bit younger. But
I truthfully came to him through like family movies like Parenthood and Cheaper by the Dozen.
But in terms of people who recall Steve Martin's career, we became aware of him in the 1970s on Saturday Night Live, and then becoming the most successful stand-up comedian arguably of all time, literally selling out stadiums. And part one tells you there was a long time that he was misunderstood, that he was not very successful, that he almost considered giving up on this whole stand-up career. I thought what was unfortunate about it was in part one, they spend a ton of time on that and very little time on he has become successful. Here's why he's become successful. Here's what he specifically learned. I felt like he kept on getting the same story sort of over and over again in part one. Like, oh, Steve tried something and it kind of didn't work. Oh, he tried kind of the same thing again and it still kind of didn't work. And then
it just sort of magically happens.
And magically works. And one of the things that I really regret about this is I don't feel like they challenged Steve Martin. He is a very private person. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like they challenged him very much. I wanted them to really sit down with him and say, what were you doing wrong? Mm-hmm. Or were you always doing it right? What was it that changed about you? And then the other thing that happens in his career is, at the height of his powers, as the most successful stand-up comedian of all time, he quits stand-up. He never does another stand-up show again and becomes exclusively a movie person. And that's the end of that.
And then he eventually steps away from movies, which then becomes part of the second part in that aspect of his decision to sort of step away from different industries, I think, is part of what makes part two way more interesting than part one for me.
But my point is, so that's the end of part one. He steps away.
Yeah.
At the top of the world of comedy. And part two picks up 30 years later, and we don't ask him anything about why did you do, to me, his career is full of lots of questions. Mm-hmm. And I don't feel like the film ever really challenged him. Now, it may have been difficult for them to do that because Steve Martin is super private. He doesn't like to talk about this stuff. And unfortunately, this documentary doesn't make him talk about it.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think for me, I found at least some fascination in part two of just the searching and even got a little bit of a hint of maybe he doesn't really even know of why he does the things he does, and that sort of unknowability, I think, being at least a little bit more fascinating than kind of the Wikipedia dump of part one. But
I will say, I think they didn't need to do this in two parts, and by that I see them as very separate documentaries, but each one of them is too long, in my opinion. Part one especially is too long.
Definitely.
But in part two, a lot of part two is him and Martin Short riding bikes or riding around in a car or going to get coffee.
Though I admit I could kind of watch that for hours.
Maybe, but I didn't get a ton of insight into, they even joke at times. They're like, maybe something interesting will happen. They literally say that.
Yes.
They're riding bikes. They're like, maybe we'll run into someone or something.
There is one kind of humorous moment where they're just sitting around playing cards and Steve Martin's I would never want to be a documentary filmmaker because you just got to watch people do boring stuff all day and try and pick out little interesting elements. So that is there is a little bit of self-awareness to the oddity of the project.
Amusing, but that's not particularly insightful to us as an audience.
Yeah. So maybe this is a chance for us to kind of wrap up with our favorite Steve Martin movies, since this is a movie show.
Sure.
And I thought it was fascinating watching part two and just kind of seeing all the different eras of movies he's had over the years, from sort of his big comedies to trying to be a dramatic actor to then going into being more of a family actor, and now he's this massive TV star. What to you is kind of your favorite Steve Martin?
I reflexively automatically went to The Jerk, which is the most iconic of them, and I'm almost hesitating not to make that my pick. But I'm going to go ahead and make my pick, a film called All of Me,
okay,
which people probably don't remember quite as well. It's Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin. The plot of this movie is that through some mysticism, Lily Tomlin's soul has entered Steve Martin's body, and she controls half his body, and he controls the other half of the body. The physical comedy that Steve Martin has to do in this film is some of the best physical comedy you'll ever see on film. The movie always makes me laugh. There are several smaller side character actors in this film who are just beyond brilliant, hysterical, and it's a movie. I've revisited it, not as much as The Jerk, but I've revisited it a few times over the years, and every time I watch it, I start laughing.
That's a good pick, because mine is kind of a cousin of that, because I think the thing I really like about my pick, which is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, is it is an example of how great of a physical comedian he is, of just, he can just give you a look that is the funniest thing you've ever seen. And there is a really beautiful moment, I thought, in the doc where he's talking about him and John Candy on the set of that movie, and kind of being guys that, even though they're playing total opposites in that movie, and you have John Candy's goofy earnestness with Steve Martin's extreme fed upness, but them in real life kind of being a little bit more compatible personality-wise, but that's just a movie of just any slight little like raise of his eyebrow in that movie, I'm like on the floor laughing. Is so funny, and I think that's just such a like testament to his power as a comedian and his like knowledge of his body as just an instrument and being able to make people laugh with just the smallest gestures.
Well, speaking of that, that's a great movie to revisit because John Candy is so brilliant in it. That, that's up there. That's arguably John Candy's best film as well, and he's someone that we really miss as a comedian today.
Well, Jason, let's give a little preview of what we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks. We'll be talking about Challengers, the tennis love triangle movie with Zendaya.
Zendaya and a threesome.
Yeah,
Just saying.
sports movie romances. We need more of them. We'll be talking about Alex Garland's Civil War.
I'm really excited for that film.
Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting. Alex Garland to me is a fascinating filmmaker. I just loved Ex Machina so much, and I'm really excited to see what he's got coming up next. And that's a film that during an election season is going to hit home for a lot of people.
Yes, and also we got on a lighter note, Ryan Gosling in the Fall Guy. So a fun little homage of a fun little look forward of spring titles to look forward to.
Absolutely, yeah.
But until then,
it's a good time of year for movies.
It is. It's kind of a fun, unexpected time. You don't know really what you're going to get. But until then, we will see you at the movies.